The courtroom buzzed with a low hum of conversation as the doors swung open, revealing a woman dressed in a crisp black suit. She walked with a quiet confidence, her every step deliberate, her chin held high. Her natural curls framed her face like a crown, but her expression remained calm, unreadable. To most in the room, she was just another defendant, another face in a sea of cases, waiting to be judged. Sitting at the bench, Judge Preston Graham barely glanced up as she approached the defendant's table. He was an older man, well known for his stern demeanor and quick judgments. His reputation for being harsh, especially toward those who didn't fit his expectations of what respectability looked like, preceded him. As the woman settled into her seat, his cold blue eyes finally lifted to meet hers. A flicker of disapproval crossed his face, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. "Name?" he barked, his voice carrying an air of impatience. "Renee Ellis," the woman replied evenly, her tone measured but firm. She met his gaze without flinching, her eyes steady, betraying no hint of the tension in the room. Preston didn't bother to hide his skepticism as he scanned the file before him. His lips curled slightly, almost imperceptibly, into a smirk. "Miss Ellis," he began, driving out her name as though it left a bad taste in his mouth. "You found yourself in quite the predicament, haven't you?" The words hung in the air, heavy with condescension. A few people in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in tone. Renee didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply clasped her hands in front of her, her demeanor composed, as if she were entirely unbothered by the judge's clear disdain. Preston leaned forward slightly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you even understand the charges against you, Miss Ellis? Or shall I simplify them for you?" A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. The courtroom clerk, seated a few feet away, stole a quick glance at Renee, as though silently willing her to respond. But Renee didn't take the bait. Instead, she maintained her calm, letting the silence stretch. Preston's smirk deepened. "I'll take that as a no," he said sharply, before turning back to his papers. "You know, it never ceases to amaze me how some people find themselves in these situations and expect leniency." Renee raised an eyebrow, finally speaking. "And what situation might that be, Your Honor?" Her question was simple, yet it carried a weight that made Preston pause for a fraction of a second. He looked up, narrowing his eyes. "One of irresponsibility," he said curtly. "Lack of respect for the law, for the system." The room seemed to hold its breath. Renee tilted her head slightly, studying the man who sat on the bench with an air of superiority. "I see," she said quietly, her tone neutral. But before she could say anything more, Preston waved a dismissive hand, cutting her off. "Let's not waste time. You're here because of your own actions, Miss Ellis. The law doesn't care for excuses, and neither do I." The tension in the room was palpable. Even those who had no idea who Renee was could sense the undertone of something more, something unspoken yet undeniable. As Preston continued to lecture, his words becoming sharper with every sentence, Renee remained composed, her gaze unwavering. It was almost as though she was waiting for something, a quiet confidence that only she understood. And then, as Preston prepared to deliver what he likely thought was the final word, something remarkable happened. The courtroom doors swung open once more, and a uniformed officer walked in, carrying a folder with the seal of the Supreme Court. "Excuse the interruption, Your Honor," the officer said, his voice steady but firm. "I have an urgent matter that needs to be addressed immediately." Preston frowned, clearly irritated by the disruption. "I'm in the middle of a hearing," he snapped. The officer didn't flinch. Instead, he walked directly toward the bench, handing Preston the folder. "You'll want to see this, sir," he said simply. Preston opened the folder, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. His eyes flicked over the contents, and then he froze. The courtroom watched in silence as the color drained from his face. He glanced up at Renee, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Renee's calm expression didn't waver. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice steady as she said, "Is there something you'd like to say, Your Honor?" Preston swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the folder. The silence in the room was deafening, the tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, Preston said the words that would leave everyone in the courtroom stunned. "Chief Justice Ellis," he said, his tone filled with disbelief. "I didn't realize." But before he could finish, Renee stood, her presence commanding the room in a way that words could never describe. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And now, let's talk about justice." The courtroom was still, the kind of silence that makes every creak of a chair or shuffle of papers sound deafening. All eyes were fixed on Renee Ellis as she stood there, poised and composed, looking every bit the embodiment of authority. It was a moment heavy with unspoken questions and raw disbelief. Judge Preston Braying shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of the realization pressing down on him like an invisible force. His stern demeanor faltered, and for the first time that anyone in his courtroom could recall, he looked unsure of himself. "I wasn't aware," Preston stammered, his voice lacking its usual authority. Renee's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of smugness, but of someone who had long learned to master the art of patience. "That much is clear," she replied smoothly, her tone cutting just enough to remind him of the gravity of his mistake. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a mix of shock and curiosity rippling through the crowd. Who was this woman? How had she gone unrecognized? And how could a man as seasoned as Judge Graham, known for his meticulousness, make such an error? As the whispers swirled, Renee took a moment to observe the room. It wasn't just Preston's courtroom. It was a stage, one she was all too familiar with. She had spent years in courtrooms like this one, where every glance, every word, every subtle gesture was a battle for respect. She had learned to navigate these spaces not just as a lawyer, but as a black woman in a system that often saw her as less than. But today it was different. Today, the roles were reversed, and the weight of that shift wasn't lost on her. The officer who had brought the Supreme Court folder stood at attention near the bench, his face carefully neutral, though his eyes occasionally flicked toward Renee with what looked like admiration. He, too, knew the magnitude of what was happening. Preston cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edges of the folder as though it might anchor him in the storm of his embarrassment. "Chief Justice Ellis," he began again, his voice quieter now. "I—" "Save it," Renee interrupted, her tone calm but firm. "This isn't about me, Your Honor. This is about the system you claim to uphold, and it's clear we have some things to discuss." Preston's mouth tightened, his usual sense of control slipping further with each passing moment. For years, he had ruled his courtroom with an iron fist, confident in his judgments and unshaken by challenges. But this was something he hadn't prepared for. As Renee's words hung in the air, a memory flickered in her mind, unbidden but vivid. She thought back to the early days of her career, when she had stood in similar courtrooms, young and eager, but often dismissed before she had even spoken a word. She remembered the condescending looks, the veiled comments about her attitude or tone. She had fought hard to get here, harder than most could imagine. And now, standing in the very space where she had once been underestimated, she felt the weight of her journey in every breath. The gallery's murmurs began to quiet as the gravity of the situation settled over the room. Preston, clearly grasping at a way to regain control, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. "Perhaps we should take a recess," he suggested, his voice tinged with desperation. Renee tilted her head, studying him with an expression that was both calm and unyielding. "A recess," she repeated, her tone making it clear she wasn't convinced. "Yes," Preston said quickly. "This matter, this misunderstanding, shouldn't play out in a public forum. It's not appropriate." Renee's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze piercing. "Not appropriate," she echoed. "Your Honor, I think we both know that transparency is essential to justice. Or is it only true when it suits your narrative?" A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Preston looked as though he'd been struck, his face reddening as he struggled to form a response. Before he could speak, Renee continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge that demanded attention. You've built a reputation, Judge Graham. A reputation for being tough, unyielding, and some might say biased. But today, we're not here to talk about your reputation. We're here to talk about accountability. Preston's jaw clenched, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might argue. The weight of the room, the collective eyes on him, the undeniable authority in Renee's stance, rendered him silent. Renee turned her attention to the gallery, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the spectators. This isn't just about one judge or one case, she said, her voice carrying a quiet power. This is about a system that too often allows prejudice to go unchecked, that too often silences those who dare to challenge it. The room was silent now, every word sinking in like stones dropped into a still pond. Even those who had come to the courtroom out of boredom or curiosity found themselves captivated, unable to look away. Renee's gaze returned to Preston, who was now sitting stiffly, his hands folded tightly in front of him. Your Honor, she said, her tone softening just enough to convey that this wasn't personal. This isn't about humiliation. It's about growth. And the first step to growth is acknowledging where we've fallen short. Preston opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly at a loss. The man who had always prided himself on having the final word now found himself searching for any response. The tension was interrupted by a soft beeping sound coming from a phone in the gallery. The sudden noise jolted the room back to the present, and a few people chuckled nervously, as though trying to ease the heavy atmosphere. Renee glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Preston. I think now might be a good time for that recess, Your Honor, she said, her tone measured. Preston hesitated, then gave a small nod, his shoulders slumping slightly. 15 minutes, he said, his voice barely audible. Will be convenient 15 minutes. As he rose from his seat and hurried toward his chambers, the gallery erupted into whispers once more, the room buzzing with speculation and disbelief. Renee remained standing for a moment, her gaze following Preston as he disappeared through the door. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and began to gather her belongings, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The officer who had brought the folder stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Chief Justice Ellis, he said quietly, if I may. Renee held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Not here, she said simply, her voice firm, but not unkind. We'll talk later. The officer nodded, stepping back respectfully as Renee made her way toward the door. The eyes of the gallery followed her every step, a mixture of awe and curiosity written on their faces. As she reached the exit, Renee paused, glancing back at the room one last time. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their hopes, their questions. And though she knew the road ahead would be far from easy, she also knew that this moment was just the beginning. With a final, steadying breath, she pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway, leaving the tension of the courtroom behind. If only for a moment. Renee walked briskly down the marble hallway, the echoes of her heels clicking against the polished floor following her like a drumbeat. The courthouse was quieter here, far from the murmurs and whispers that had filled the courtroom moments earlier. But she knew that the silence was temporary. Conversations would spark, rumors would fly, and soon enough, her name would be at the center of it all. For now, she welcomed the brief reprieve, the solitude giving her space to gather her thoughts. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, determination, and yes, a faint flicker of satisfaction. She didn't take joy in embarrassing Judge Graham, but she also couldn't deny the importance of the moment. For too long, people like him had been able to operate unchecked, their biases cloaked in the guise of authority. As she turned a corner, Renee nearly bumped into a young woman carrying an armful of files. The woman looked up, her face flushing with embarrassment as she stammered an apology. Renee offered a kind smile, steadying her. It's all right, Renee said softly. Take a breath. The woman nodded, her eyes widening slightly as recognition dawned on her. You're Chief Justice Ellis, she said, her voice a mixture of awe and nervousness. Renee gave a small nod, her smile remaining warm. And you are? Naomi, the woman replied quickly. I'm a clerk in Judge Graham's chambers. Renee raised an eyebrow. Her interest piqued. I see, she said, her tone neutral but inviting. Naomi hesitated, as though debating whether to say more. Finally, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. If I can be honest, ma'am, not everyone in his chambers agrees with how he handles things. Renee's expression didn't change, but her mind sharpened at the words. She had suspected as much. It wasn't uncommon for those who worked closely with someone like Preston Graham to see cracks in the facade. Naomi glanced around nervously, then added, He's a good judge in some ways, but there are times when his decisions feel personal, if that makes sense. It does, Renee replied, her voice calm. And I appreciate your honesty, Naomi. Naomi nodded quickly, clutching her files tighter. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. I admire what you're doing. Renee placed a reassuring hand on Naomi's shoulder. Thank you, Naomi. Your courage means more than you know. As Naomi hurried off, Renee couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the young clerk. It wasn't easy to work under someone like Graham, especially when you disagreed with their methods. But Naomi's words confirmed what Renee had long suspected. The system wasn't just flawed, it was fractured. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere remained tense. The gallery buzzed with speculation, the weight of what had just unfolded settling heavily over the room. Preston Graham had returned to his chambers, where he now paced back and forth, his mind racing. He was no stranger to criticism. Every judge faced it at some point. But this was different. Renee Ellis wasn't just another attorney or litigant. She was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and she had called him out in front of everyone. Preston paused by the window, staring out at the bustling city below. He had worked his entire career to earn the respect of his peers, to build a reputation as a man who upheld the law with unwavering authority. But now, in a single moment, all of that felt precariously close to unraveling. He thought back to the day he had first met Renee. It had been years ago, long before she had risen to her current position. She had been a young attorney then, passionate and relentless in her pursuit of justice. Even then, she had challenged him, forcing him to reconsider his biases in ways he hadn't been ready to admit. And now, here she was again, standing in his courtroom, reminding him of the very flaws he had tried so hard to ignore. In the gallery, conversations began to shift. Some whispered about the power dynamics at play, debating whether Renee's actions were justified. Others speculated about what this confrontation might mean for Judge Graham's career. Amid the chatter, a man in the back row leaned forward, his expression unreadable. He had been silent throughout the proceedings, his presence unnoticed by most. But his eyes never left Renee, studying her with an intensity that suggested he knew more than he let on. This man, Marcus Haynes, was an investigative journalist, and he had been following Renee's career for years. He had seen her rise through the ranks, watched as she dismantled systemic injustices one case at a time. And now, seeing her stand toe-to-toe with Preston Graham, he knew there was a story here, one that the world needed to hear. As the 15-minute recess drew to a close, the gallery began to quiet once more. Spectators returned to their seats, eager to see how the drama would unfold. Renee re-entered the courtroom, her expression calm and composed, though her mind remained sharp and alert. She had no intention of letting her guard down. Not yet. Preston returned moments later, his face a mask of forced neutrality. But the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. He took his seat, clearing his throat before addressing the room. We'll resume the proceedings, he said, his voice steady, but lacking its usual confidence. Renee watched him closely, noting the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his papers. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes. As the hearing continued, the conflict between them simmered just beneath the surface, an unspoken tension that everyone in the room could feel. Renee chose her words carefully, her tone measured but firm, each statement a subtle reminder of her authority. Preston, for his part, tried to maintain his composure, though his responses occasionally betrayed his frustration. The power dynamic had shifted, and he was struggling to adapt. But beneath the surface of this courtroom drama lay deeper questions about justice, accountability, and the ways in which power could be both wielded and abused. And though neither Renee nor Preston would admit it, they both knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for Renee, the stakes were clear. This wasn't just about one judge or one case. It was about transforming a system that had resisted change for far too long. As the hearing drew to a close, the gallery remained riveted, their attention fixed on the unfolding drama. And as Renee gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The fight for justice was never easy. But Renee Ellis was no stranger to a challenge. And as she walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, she knew one thing for certain: she was just getting started.